whiteout conditions. I haven't seen a blizzard like this in 50 years. You'd have to be crazy to go outside tonight.
Small towns keep their secrets, sometimes for decades, until an outsider dares to ask questions.
The president of Cross College was assassinated by a professor who turned the gun on himself in November 1963. Why?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, isn't it?
When John Pilate moved to faraway Cross Township, he left behind a life he was eager to forget. His new job at Cross College would be a quiet place to rebuild his life, or so he thought. Sometimes small towns reveal more than secrets to outsiders, and what was meant to be simple can easily become complicated.
John, I want to be with you, but I don't think you're going to stay in Cross for long.
And a mystery can be as powerful and irresistible as love.
There's something going on here, and it's all tied to the murder of the Cross College president in 1963.
John, it's not your concern. You really don't fit in here. For your own sake, get out of Cross while you can.
And Pilate may self-destruct on his own if his imaginary pal Simon gets his way.
Why not end this? Escape this veil of tears, shovel off this mortal coil, take the dirt now. Of all the imaginary friends in the world, I have to get the psycho who wants me dead. Everyone needs a hobby.
The small town of Cross gets smaller as Pilate zeroes in on the decades-old conspiracy.
What happens to a person's ashes if nobody claims them?
And makes himself a target. Ultimately, this outsider will have to survive the elements, outsmart the conspirators, and overcome his personal demons. John Pilate will learn that washing his hands of murder isn't easy in Pilate's Cross.
Hello and welcome to Mysterious Goings On. You probably don't recognize my voice. I am a guest host today. I'm Brian, and Alex interviewed me a couple of weeks ago related to the creative process. I enjoyed it thoroughly. It was a great time that we spent together. And I suggested that he being a very creative person as well, it might be a good idea for me to interview him. So on this episode, the tables are turned, and let me introduce author and public speaker, general creative person, and a friend of mine that I've known for a lot of years, Alex Greenwood. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. I love your show.
Long-time listener, first-time caller.
It's great to be on it. And thank you for being such a wonderful guest, by the way. The interview with you talking about creativity in the food service product design space and how restaurants work and all that, by the way, it's one of the top downloaded episodes in the history of the show. Awesome. People love it. It's really great. So thanks so much for having me.
Sure. It's my pleasure, and I'm glad I get to do this. I know, you would not probably have spoken as much about your process had I not jumped in and interviewed you. So I hope the listeners will appreciate your, revealing some of your process in this space as well.
Yeah, particularly, I think it's kind of a twofer. Hopefully the interview we'll both be happy with goes that way, where you're not only asking me about my process, but we're talking about a book series that is just replete with crazy, interesting stuff. So
yeah, absolutely. And now we're 10 years in. Is that correct?
This is our 10th year of the John Pilate Mysteries, and I can think of no better month, by the way, than October to be talking about this stuff, because this is the month of most of the books. I know Pilate's Ghost. I know the upcoming Pilate book, which I have not done the cover reveal as of this interview, or the title reveal as of this interview yet. But probably will reveal it here because by the time this goes to air, it should be out. But that's coming on Halloween as well. October's my favorite month, and it's just so great. And so how wonderful that it all timed out what we're talking about. the spooky subject in the spooky month.
Yeah, it's and that's something I hope we get into, which is the pilot series is not only about mystery; it's about the mysterious in a lot of ways, which I think is kind of fun. It really turns the genre just a little bit.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've tried to do that.
So let me start.
All right.
By predating. We're going to predate the books by 70 years to an inspirational event that led to some of the character development and some of the story development in the pilot series.
Yeah, I mean, in this true story, I eventually found a way to start the germ, the seed for an entire series. And yeah, it all stems back to a fateful day, April 25th, 1950, at a small land-grant college in southeast Nebraska. And
okay, so let's
sure.
jump in and say, okay. So my first question for you then is how did you learn about this story?
I was just a month or two into a new job. I'd moved from, as you know, and some of our listeners know, I was originally from Oklahoma. I'd spent about the first 30 to 33 years of my life there. And long story short, I took a job, kind of changed everything in my life. I'd lost an election, and I'd lost a friend, a close friend had passed away. My beloved grandfather had passed away. All this happened in about a year. And the company I was working for was starting to implode. It wasn't my company, but I was a VP there. It was just all the signs pointed north for me. It was like, get out of town. Go.
Right.
This place is not for you anymore. And so, as you know, I did clean break. Did something similar to what you did when you joined the service years before. You just like, my destiny is elsewhere. And I left and took a job as a director of PR, public affairs, marketing for a small college in Nebraska. It was called Peru State College. And Peru State is the oldest college in Nebraska. It was formed in 1867. Anyway, I was more or less the right arm to the president of the college, Dr. Johnson. He hired me, really charismatic guy. He and I looked like a good team, a good unit. And that's a lot of my career before I started my own PR agency was that. I was usually the right arm to a C-suite executive. You know, PR people often are. So anyway, we developed a great relationship. So about a month in, it's just funny. This is a tiny little town real quick. It's like 600 people at the time. And then unless the school was in session, then it ballooned up to, 1,500 or something like that. So I remember I was hired, and I came into my office one morning, had my coffee, and there on my desk is this big fat manila envelope, like sealed, and there's a Post-it note on it. And so I believe it said something it was in the president's handwriting, and it was something to the effect of, this comes up from time to time. Please make sure you're up to speed on it.
Familiar with it. Okay.
So I opened the envelope, and there's roughly 60, 70 pages worth, basically, of the tale of a murder-suicide at Peru State College back in 1950.
Wow.
So this was 2003. And I'm reading about something that happened in 1950. And I read about the main thing, and I think I sent this to you, B, was the Nebraska history article by Nancy Moran.
Correct. Yeah, that detailed it fairly well, at least the basic events.
Right. It's a good chronology, and I think it's out of print, but it had that. But then it had dozens of affidavits, and it had crime scene photos and all this stuff. And I remember just reading it and not looking up for another hour.
So that was, how did you get access to all of this was literally police statements, not information that's readily available to the public. How did you get a hold of?
Well, apparently, and I later asked the president, who didn't know a lot about it. He had read it too, but he had just read it. But he was like assigning this to me, and I asked around. I asked the librarian, Roger, I believe, and a couple others, and they said, well, there's a little bit more here and there, and they helped me with that. But apparently, the school, because it's an educational institution anyway, and the event happened there, they had copies of everything. I didn't have to go very far to find anything. It was all there. It was I mean, Brian, it was literally a gift. It was like, here.
Here's the story.
Yeah, and just, do you want me to quickly run through the story, or do you...
Yes. So knowing that, tell me what happened. We'll maybe start with just that chronology of the facts, and then we may I'll ask. We'll try and add some color or some conjecture as to the why here in a bit. But start with what happened
on that fateful Tuesday morning in 1950. Professor Barney Baker, psychology professor, he did his class in the morning, and he gave 3 weeks of assignments going forward, and then he said that there's going to be half a holiday that day, which everybody's like, okay. So around 11 o'clock, he goes to the offices of the college president, Dr. Nicholas, and then the head of the education division, Dr. Maxwell, who was ostensibly the dean, his boss, and shot them both in the head. And then he calmly walked past, just imagine gunshots fired at an admin building, 2 different offices, people screaming, people running up and down stairs. It's 1952. Nobody's on their phone or anything. Everybody's just losing their mind. And he calmly walks out to his office, drops the empty magazine from his 30, I think it's a 32 caliber, I think semi-auto, drops the magazine on his desk, puts on his coat, walks back to his house on campus, not far from the campus at least. It's a tiny town. It's not a hard walk. Puts out a note and shoots himself in the head. And there he is. So, I mean, that's the very bare bones thing. But I need everybody to think about this. Was 1950. School shootings were not the thing. It was not
right.
People
this
heard about
not
this.
Not a common occurrence.
Right. It was not common, and it made worldwide news. Of course, it was reminiscent of an event I was unfortunately part of in my career later, where the terrorist attack in Oklahoma City, and I remember just handling calls from all over the world. Well, it was just interesting because if you read this in this piece by Nancy. The basically the de facto PR guy for the school talks about how he's handling calls from all over the world. So just think about that. So that's what happened in general. Why and how, I'll leave that to you to ask about.
Let's jump in. There seemed to have been, one, he appeared to have been let go.
Yeah, Dr. Baker he was the only PhD on the faculty in this area, I believe, but he was not beloved, I don't think, and he also had a lot of classes that weren't filled out, and there were rumors the school was going to maybe be closed, and so they had to do some belt tightening, and he just looked like the best place to do some belt tightening. So it's not like they called him in one day and just flat out fired him and said, pack your crap and go. The president said, I will help you find another job. This is just for the good of the school. And Baker took it really hard, really personally. Yeah. And this was not a crime of like, I'm going to go do this. He planned it. He'd written a letter, a suicide note. He had written, he had taken care of his bank accounts. He had taken care of his wife. He had taken care of all the things he needed to do. He'd put all his ducks in a row. And the last 2 or 3 ducks were killing those men and himself.
Wow.
And what's interesting is there's some conjectures that whether he really actually meant to kill anybody but the president, because
like it was convenience because the other person happened to be in the office.
Yeah, like he was walking by and he's like, in for a penny, right? Might as well. I mean, there's some conjecture there because I think some of the stuff he wrote later made it sound like Maxwell may be alive after I'm gone, and I'm not sure about that 100%. It's been a long time, but either way, he murdered those people. He traumatized. I mean, both of these men's assistants. One of the assistants, Dr. Maxwell's assistant, saw him put the gun to Maxwell's head and pull the trigger. And Maxwell never saw it coming because he had a habit of not looking up when people came in his office. He was always reading or doing something, and unless they addressed him, he just assumed somebody was putting papers on his desk or whatever. He didn't even look up, but his assistant, she saw it, and so imagine that trauma. And then, of course, Miss Steppen, who was the president's assistant, she heard the shots, but he'd gone behind closed doors, and you've seen.
So she was in an outer office, and he was in the the inner office.
Yeah, and it's creepy knowing too, by the way, that I officed in that building.
Right.
And
yeah.
I tried to remember. I think there had been some remodeling since then, so the exact spaces were no longer being used by the same people. And I'm probably going to get called out on this. I'm trying to remember, but I think that at least the office where Dr. Maxwell, where the dean basically was, I think that got turned into a storeroom or a closet or something. Maybe it
changed the space dramatically.
Yeah, at least. So who knows? But around 2003 through around 2006, when I was there, that's what it was like. But it was, it's funny because I'd asked, because I'd work a lot of late nights. I had nothing else to do at that job. It was a very small town. All I had to do was, I was also sports information director in a lot of ways. So I would go shoot volleyball games and football games and basketball games, come back, process the photos. I just had nothing else to do. So I'd be there late at night. And I'm disappointed to relate to you that I don't think I was ever haunted by anybody.
No hauntings.
No pilot's ghost.
So they're very good. So something that I found pretty interesting, just putting things in time and maybe in the personality of the nation standpoint, is that the murderer just calmly walked past the secretary.
Yeah.
The female administrators.
Yeah.
And it was almost like it was, I'm going to commit this heinous crime, but keep the women and children out of it.
Yeah, because
it just walks by.
Right. That's funny. No, it's not funny. Haha. It's an interesting thing, and the idea is that he had his grievances, but he had no stomach for collateral damage, is what I'm hearing too. Right. Not only is it the quasi sexist of the time to not shoot women and children, but also, as insane as he obviously was in those moments, there was a clarity of thought. It was like, you wronged me, I'm gonna get you.
Right.
And so that's it's a great point. It's creepy as hell too, because when you think about some of the affidavits where they say I was going up the stairs while he was coming down, and he had a gun. He could have blasted away at several people, and just didn't. And a couple of these people he didn't particularly like. That he let off the hook because they were young up and comers who were taking his job, but he didn't blame them. He blamed the bosses.
Right. Yeah, and it's such an interesting. You mentioned the premeditation of and preparation leading up to the event, and it's interesting. There was kind of an interesting note that he left about basically a handwritten will, if you will.
Yeah.
You want?
Let me. It's short enough to where I could read part of it to you, if that's what
please.
you'd like. Let me dig this up here.
Okay.
This is from Dr. Barney Baker. He left this to C.A. Huck, who was a part-time math instructor at the college, and I guess the closest thing he had left to a trusted friend. Part of this ended up making it into the book. Mr. Huck, please take charge. Use Casey of Auburn as director. That's funeral director. He wanted to use Casey. Okay. Auburn is the next town over from Peru. Services about $400. Cremate and scatter the ashes at night on the south side of the road, about 8 telephone poles east of the Peru corner. That's basically where it's not on campus. It's where you turn off the main road to get to the campus.
What can I interject? Is there something there? Is there something particular there?
I think there is. And I think actually, because people were outraged and thought, oh, wow, he wants to put his ashes on Peru College? No way. But no, actually, like I said, it's like you go off that main road, off the highway, the state highway, and you go down about 8 telephone poles. There's a rise. And I've, of course, driven this a million times. And it's beautiful at sunset. He and his wife would often stop and look at the sunset from there.
Okay, interesting.
So then he continues with, let only one person know what you have done. Funeral services at chapel with Presbyterian procedure. No relatives are to be notified except Joy, that's his wife, who is in Oklahoma City. Stay in my house at night or get someone to until things quiet down. He put quiet down. Misspelled quiet. Quiet down. PC might try to cause trouble. I think that's surmised that's the son of, I think, Dr. Maxwell, who was kind of a hothead and apparently did pack a gun and went looking with a mob for Baker after the shootings, but of course Baker take care of this. You are to be paid for your services. P.S. Take charge of my office and bring everything down to the house. Signed, B.K. Baker, and then handwritten in ink. The rest was typed. Willie tried to fire the wrong person.
Wow.
And that would be President Maxwell. That's what he called William Maxwell.
Yeah.
That right there, Willie tried to fire the wrong person.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So okay, so this event happens, and in a small town. I mean, it made global news,
right?
But it's in a small town. That must have just been a huge scandal.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments in Nancy's article and some other stuff I've dug up where, people are writing about it and saying that this is interesting to me. And I would love to, let me just dig this up here. There's this great comment from one of the local media, like from somebody who wrote like a little Peru paper, and they had all these funerals and all these things happen, but the media attention upset the residents of Peru a lot. Corinne Adams wrote in her West Side Items column of the Peru Pointer, quote, "One of the hardest points of the week was the way the reporters and newscasters handled the affair, having a field day. Their methods seemed harsh and their product sensational."
It's like a double murder suicide. Why can't we get on about our daily business?
Yeah, that's hilarious. That's so funny. But the other part is just like, it's like today we still say this about the media. Oh my God, like if it bleeds, it leads. Oh, there's a house fire, there's a murder, there's a robbery. It's been going on for 70 years here at least,
or more. I mean, yeah,
more.
This
Yeah,
is just
definitely more.
So yeah, so interesting, so interesting. So now let's spring forward now to so you've had this story. You did with a lot of it given to you, but then you do some independent research. At what point did it click that this was the seed of another story?
I gathered all the materials I could, and I photocopied that entire file, by the way, that the president had left on my desk, and then some other stuff that I found and some other research that I dug up on microfiche and things like that. And because again, you remember I had plenty of time when I wasn't working to right. And I was not in a frame of mind. I'd written things before. I had a degree in writing, but I had come off such a really rotten few years, and I had a bad health scare too. So that's, and I'm mentioning some of this stuff because if you've read Pilate's Cross, you're going to be going, oh my God, he didn't just borrow from, history. He borrowed from his own history to a degree. And we can talk about that if you wish, but I'd had a health scare, thought I had cancer. These things happened and I just wasn't in frame of mind to write, but it was interesting. But I knew full well, because my grandfather, who was a noted author of books for 50 years, he told me about how things percolate, and I knew for a fact how things percolate in my own brain. So I thought, well, I'm going to photocopy all this, and someday I'll get to it. And it turned out that I left Peru to come to Kansas City and take a job at the TV station here, at the PBS station, and to be to date the young lady who became my wife. And I got an apartment on the plaza, the Country Club Plaza area, Kansas City, which if you've ever visited Kansas City, it's that really quaint, 75, 80-year-old shopping center, one of the first outdoor shopping centers in America. And I had an apartment that overlooked it, and it was beautiful. And I did the cliche. I took that packet of stuff, and I went down to the Starbucks, and I sat there on my laptop, and this was in 2005, 2006.
Okay.
I sat out there, and for 3 months straight, I would go almost every weeknight and cranked out pages. What I decided to do was I thought, this story has legs. There's some interesting things here. And my plan was not to just blatantly rip it off and do that, although plenty of authors do that with real life events. There's nothing wrong with it. But I also, having lived there in that town and knowing that even many years later, decades later, it was still a wound for that town. But I still wanted to use it. And I wanted to use that town because I had fallen in love with Peru, Nebraska, and Peru State College. And I wanted to do kind of anybody who's a close friend of mine or loves me or I love them, they know that, with my love comes occasional barbs and problems and things. And so I express, so I expressed my love though for that town, and I made it into Cross Township with Cross College. And I decided that town was going to be the backdrop for this story of a guy who, here, see if this rings a bell for you. He had lost kind of everything. His marriage broke up. His job fell out. He had a health issue, and he just took a job because he needed a job, and he didn't know anybody. Yada yada. Huh? Makes sense.
Sure.
And so I brought him to this town, and then I thought, well, what we got to do is we got to connect this modern guy with this old mystery. So I updated the mystery. The murder-suicide is pretty similar to what happened in 1950. I moved it up to November 1963 because I wanted, Kennedy assassination. I wanted that parallel of two chief executives being assassinated within a week of each other, one on a magnificently huge macro scale, and one, but to your previous comment, on a huge macro scale in a micro place. In other words, it was this tiny town, but it was the biggest thing that had ever happened.
Right. Yeah. And this is, I find this fascinating because, you look at the assassination, which they had just experienced in the book.
Right.
And that they experienced personally as distant observers,
right?
And then you turn that to experiencing it as actively as very personal observers, and that I think that changes the perspective. I mean, I think you can even something as tragic as that. You remember where you were and what you were doing and who you were talking to. But you're able to, I think, disconnect from it. But an event that's personal in nature, you experience it very differently. And I like that juxtaposition that you did leading into the book.
Well, thank you. There's a scene where Dottie Mostek, who is the assistant to the president who's going to be assassinated, she's still in tears at her desk reading about Kennedy and the funeral and the picture of John. That picture's on the front page of the paper, and she's still there. And there's these gentlemen from the office supply store or whatever there to try to get a new contract, and they're out in the anteroom, and they're all just uncomfortable because this, and then Brady Bernard kind of shuffles through and barges ahead of these guys, and they're like, no, it's okay, fine, and they're all like, wow, that's a nice fella. I mean, it just, I wanted to set that stage, and I also wanted to establish that Brady Bernard was kind of a Lee Oswald type guy. He was off. He was different. His social skills were not great. And again, this is my take on this character. I never met Barney Baker, and I can only tell you what I read.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about that writing process. So your events, you said, loosely based and sometimes closely based on some events that either you've personally experienced or you read about. The same with characters. So there's some similarities between those characters and what you believe to be the historical character, but you're also drawing from other people that both you personally encountered, as well as there's some semi-autobiographical components to characters. There are amalgams of people that you've met. How do you draw those things together?
And I know my limits. I am not a good enough writer to just completely blue sky it, as I call it. I have to have...
Imagine someone from scratch.
It's hard for me. Right. John Pilate is very similar to me. He is not me. And
Sure.
It's a question I deal with a lot, and especially because John Pilate, by the way, we haven't even talked about John much, but John is an open wound, particularly in this book in so many ways, and that's brought to life literally by Simon. But the point being, I had tried for years to write stuff. I have 4 failed novels in a drawer somewhere. They'll never see the light of day. They're just not very good. But they're things I had to write to learn to write.
Right.
And that's, there's people always go, I wrote some bad stuff. I'm so embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed by it because that's what it was. It was a learning process. Now, if one of them accidentally got published, I'd be thrilled, but it didn't happen. So, okay. So I had to learn to write, but that's why a lot of times I have a hard time like getting out of the mold I'm in. I would love to write. I love science fiction, and I would love to write science fiction, but man, I don't have a good frame of reference for how to do that, and I'm working on some stuff.
Right.
And in fact, in Pilot 7, there's some short stories. I actually put John Pilate in a science fiction vibe in one of the stories, and I was really pleased with it. But so anyway, back to your question. I'm sorry, I'm going on, but what I feel like this event in 1950 that I took gave me like a cradle for me to birth this thing out of, or not birth, but for me to kind of raise this thing up. And I needed that because my creative process was, okay, here, you've got these people. Like, for example, my grandfather wrote historical fiction, and I think it helped him. He could make great characters, but he had like the hanging Judge Parker from Fort Smith. He would use him. But, I like this because I can go, okay, I've got like this character. Now he's Brady Bernard, and I can kind of make him, he's like a, what do you call it?
Maybe an anchor?
An anchor, yeah, thank you. And he's like an anchor or a foundation.
Right,
and I can build him up.
So you've got a skeleton.
Yes.
You've got a skeleton of some, maybe some kernels of true events.
Right.
And true people.
Right.
And then, you're adding to that skeleton, adding some sinew and
right. Well, it's like
flesh to it.
Right, and then in subsequent, like for example, there's characters, the modern characters too. Though it's like, okay, John Pilate, obviously he's similar to me. His love interest Kate is an amalgam of 3 or 4 women I've known in my life. Trevathan, the dean of the school, he is very much like a dean I knew at a college I worked at, but not completely. He's also got a little bit of my grandpa in him.
Hence the name.
Hence the name, Trevathan, right? But he, by the way, my grandpa was never as ornery as Dean Trevathan. Dean Trevathan's like kind of a son of a bitch through a lot of it. But so yeah, I'm sorry to take so long to answer that question because it's one that's hard to. But I want to admit that early on, especially with this book.
Right.
It's nerve-wracking because I really wanted to do well and I wanted to do right by the story, and I thought it was too good an opportunity to blow it by writing a crappy book.
Very good. Very good. So for as advice for other writers that are maybe leery of using what they're close to and what they know, what would your advice be? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but
well, the first thing is just remember this, and it's in the front of the book. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, brands, media, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. The author acknowledges the trademark status and trademark owners of various products referenced in this work of fiction, which have been used without permission. Thus, publication use of these trademarks is not authorized, associated with, or sponsored by the trademark owners. That's your get out of jail free card, and I mean it doesn't mean it gives you license to base on a living person, a character who is so obviously that person, and then you make them into awful person. I mean, you don't want to slander anybody,
sure.
But again, it's a work of fiction, so that's your ticket right there. Is like if you are like, I want to do a story, I want to write something, but I need a little help, maybe getting that first bite of the apple. Finding an historical event, particularly an historical event that's really not ever been used at any other time.
Sure.
Hang your hat on that and build it out from that. I think there's nothing wrong with, well, obviously I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
And I sweated it a little. I mean, the first 2 or 3 books I kept thinking somebody's going to like slam me for using this, and nobody ever did. And maybe it's because nobody heard about it or nobody read it, although I did plenty of book signings here in Kansas City area and in Nebraska, and never had anybody bring it up.
Yeah, but it was, again, it's not identical. It's just inspired by, just as your characters are inspired by pieces of yourself, pieces of friends, acquaintances, those you interact with. I think, don't hold me to this. I know I read it somewhere. That does not necessarily mean it's true, but that there was some studies that in dream state, the faces that you interact with in your dreams are faces that you've seen, and that your brain is incapable of creating things from scratch. So now I don't know if they can piece together the eyes of this person you saw on the bus and the mouth of this person that you tripped over at the 7-Eleven. But I think it's the same with the creative process in your writing as well.
I think you're right. It's such a great bit. I'm going to look that up. I'm curious about that. I don't know how you prove that, obviously, but I think
Right.
it makes sense. My favorite author is Gore Vidal, and one of my favorite books is Burr, and he took Aaron Burr, who is even more maligned. I never thought that'd be more possible. The rise of the musical Hamilton has made Aaron Burr even more of a misunderstood villain in my eyes. But anyway, but if you look at Gore Vidal, hell, most of his career is just taking, like Gore Vidal's Lincoln, all these different books he wrote were based on historical events and historical figures, and he just brought them to life. He did a lot of great research, but obviously he did not have transcripts of conversations between Theodosia Burr and her father, and Al Hamilton and all that. So
you're filling in blanks.
You're filling in blanks, and you're fleshing things out, and you're entertaining people that way. So I think that's a very, thank you for that observation. I think that's a very valuable thing. And I also did salt this or spice this entire first book with you saw. I sent you a few samples of some of the affidavits. There's dozens of affidavits from witnesses.
Right. Yes.
I actually will confess to taking verbatim sentences from some of those affidavits and using them as dialogue.
Well, and that makes it real.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of the dialogue of each character inhabits or exhibits their personality.
Yeah.
So the way in which they speak isn't Alex.
No,
it's each character, and so some have great grammar and diction, some not so much, and understanding that this is set in a more rural environment, that some are well educated, some not so much, but all that again adds some different. It adds just color and feel to the book. It makes it more natural, relatable, believable.
It's the verisimilitude is the word that you've got to have enough real, or it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. That's why the worst science fiction, for example, is the stuff that is just so out there, and the dialogue is really robotic. There's nothing to connect it to real life at all. So there's no verisimilitude. There's not that spice that makes the spaghetti sauce, as Stephen King would say. It's not there. So I had to be careful of that. And to me, though, it just this Pilot's Cross was a labor of love, but it was hard. And if I had not had this framework to work from, and if I had not had some things that kind of helped me really flesh out characters and make them something beyond two-dimensional kind of cutouts that you'd expect, because I view this book as a critical success. When I say or a qualified success, excuse me, I think it's a successful first novel. Is it the best thing I ever wrote? No, but am I proud of it? Yes. And was it a lot of hard work? Oh my God, yes. And so it's and it's the one I kind of. It's ironic because I have now soon 7 books in this series, right?
Right. Just and again, you're in. We're about to celebrate 10 years of the pilot.
It'll be December 7th or something like that is the 10th year. Yeah, and but it's like, I hate to admit this, but some people say, "Oh, I want to start reading your series," and I'm like, I almost wish you didn't have to start with Pilot's Cross. It's a good book. To me, it's like Star Trek. Think about this. It's like the Star Trek movies, the original. It's like, okay, everybody loves Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, right? Yeah. But not everybody likes the movie that came before it, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, because it's slower and it's a little clunky in places. It's bigger budget and it has probably a bigger story, but it's just not as interesting to most film fans as an exciting action film movie.
Yep.
Okay, Pilot's Cross could be Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and then Pilot's Key, the second book, is Wrath of Khan. I mean, it's just the way it seems to have shaken out. That Pilot's Key has sold triple the number of Pilot's Crosses. Sometimes I just tell people start with Pilot's Key, and if they like it, to go back.
So for a new reader, so this becomes the prologue to the series.
But I don't want to sell it short. There's so much more exposition. It's the first book, but the problem is I had a writer friend. Well, I'm not going to let you off the hook saying it's exposition for the series because you didn't know you were writing a series. He said there's just a lot of rookie exposition in here, and I'm like, well, I didn't know how any other way to tell the story. And it wasn't like that friend was like killing me for it. He was just teasing me a little bit. Like, please don't act like you were going to write the whole series because you told me yourself years ago this is the one and done and.
Sure.
Get it out of my system, but I couldn't. I just couldn't.
So back to the locale. I wanted to maybe drill in on that. As you know, I kind of grew up in a small Midwestern town. I went to undergraduate at a maybe a little bit larger, but not much larger.
That's where we met.
Small liberal arts college in a fairly rural area. So for me, I think I'm one of many, many people in the flyover states and flyover cities or towns that can just relate to the way that you describe the surroundings.
Oh,
so for me, we've talked a lot about character, but creating a visual picture of the area is another I think key to your creative process to drawing people in to the entire scene. You want to maybe talk about how you do that as well?
It makes me feel really good that you say that because frankly I think I'm not the best. That's not the strongest part of my work. I think and maybe I'm wrong, but I think I write pretty good. You already said this, really good dialogue, and I bring characters to life that way. But I'm also fairly minimalist in describe. I am not one of those painterly writers who's got to describe everything and every stitch of clothing. I'm not doing a catalog, so I don't want to describe every stitch of clothing. I might describe one or two aspects of what they're wearing, and I might describe. See, this is what's interesting that you say this because I might describe one or two things about where they are. Mm-hmm. Or maybe a smell, or you know what I mean, or a color of a leaf, but that's about it. But if it's doing the job for you, though, because apparently it puts you in the place. So.
Yeah, maybe it allows my imagination or the reader's imagination to fill in the blanks.
I think you should. I think writers who I don't like reading books where the writer is holding my hand the whole time, and I purposely, by the way, go out of my way to not describe. Nobody really knows what John Pilate looks like. Mm-hmm. Now, you have a better idea, Kate, because one, she has a great ass in her Levi's and she has blonde hair, right? But that could be anybody. I mean, how many great blonde-haired beauties have you seen in your day? You make that any way you can. Trevathan, the one thing we know about Trevathan is that his eye got damaged in the war in Vietnam. So he's got steel gray buzz cut or crew cut hair. That's it. And he's tall. And Jack Lindstrom, well, I always draw, I believe he has a goatee, but he also, he has some kind of facial hair, and he's always impeccably dressed, but impeccably dressed in this location is overly dressed. He's a little too much of a dandy for this job in this town, which says a lot about him, right? So I appreciate that. So when I'm doing things, like I said, I don't want to be overly led by the author, and therefore as a writer, I don't want to overly lead you either. I want to just give you a few little bits and pieces, and apparently that does work to get you in the mood. And because there's nothing better than your own imagination. Because I view my writing as a partner with your imagination.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, it works. And then from here, I will maybe skip around a lot, but John escapes the crosstown ship and,
he survives,
and then goes to some more exotic locations,
right?
Spend some time in Key West and so from a process standpoint, was it just an area that you fell in love with, that you personally wanted to relay that love, or what was the rationale for for jumping to something that different.
Pilate goes from Pilate's Cross, as you said. He leaves Cross Township, and then he goes to Key West, Florida, for new adventures in Pilate's Key. But he still brings along with him people from Cross, and that there's still plenty going on from Cross. But why did that happen? Well, there's something. There is a theme with John Pilate. Is he's always running away from something, usually himself.
Right.
But he had this very traumatic. He survives. Sorry, folks. If I'm giving you a spoiler here, well, there are 7 books, so he probably survived. He survives, but barely. What happens in Pilate's Cross, and he needs to rest and relax and recover and go there. And so the reason that happened, why people are like, God, Key West, that's a complete what? Who?
Yeah.
Well, the reason is because and here we go with Mr. Imagination here, me again. My wife and I, we got married in 2006, and we honeymooned. We got married in Florida, and we honeymooned in the Florida Keys. And actually, we stayed on Marathon. Don't do that. It's okay, but it's if you want like a lot of excitement and stuff and nightlife, which we did back at that time. We were younger than we are now. Marathon wasn't it, but we took a day and went down all the way to Key West, and man, we had a blast. So much fun. I fell in love with conch fritters. We did a ghost tour of Key West, and boy, did that open up so many of the things. Like there's a whole practically chapter in Pilate's Key about all the weirdness of Key West, because I wanted to go from Pilate's Cross, where all this small town weirdness, and I wanted to go to another small town, because Key West is a tiny town too. It's on a tiny island.
Right.
It's the only part of the Caribbean the United States has, and it's right out there. And I thought, I want to go to another a tiki drink flavored weird town and have some shit go on there. And I wanted that whole idea. And that may be, by the way, though, where I finally came up with a character that loosely based on a friend of mine, but I invented this new character that became huge with the readers. Taters Malley was born in Key West. And
good old Tater.
Good old Tater. He was just sitting there having his breakfast, and he and Pilate actually almost get crossways in that first meeting and all. But that character, he's loosely based on a buddy of mine, but this buddy of mine is not a crusty charter boat captain. He is not a lot of these things, but there's a certain aspect of his personality I thought, ooh, that would work here. Pilate's Key, I wrote that so quickly.
Yeah.
It's the Wrath of Khan of the series, and it really has done well. I think I wrote it in 3 months, and then within another 3 months, it was out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'd gotten my confidence finally from Cross, and that's how.
So it may be reflecting back on your discussion of Pilate's Cross. Is you now have some fleshed out characters that you just need to now drop into an interesting place in an interesting story, and that makes maybe the writing a little bit easier.
People have asked me before. I've been interviewed a little bit here and there, and they said, so tell me, what do readers like about your series? I say, well, here's what I think they like. Is like my mysteries are crap. Okay, there's not like Agatha Christie is getting no competition out of me. But here's what it is. I want to take interesting people, and I think I've got a really nice roster of interesting characters, and I drop them into mysterious or suspenseful or thrilling situations. And there's a little bit. I'm being a little hard on the mysteries. I mean, there are some mysteries involved, and there's some guessing going on. But Pilate is not a detective. Pilate is just this guy. And he just stumbles into shit, and he's got friends who help him. But more often than not, Pilate doesn't even survive by his wits. He just survives by sheer luck.
Right.
But he has a blast doing it. And although, as we get closer into this last book that's coming out soon, he's been put through the ringer, and he's got mental issues.
Sure.
And he always has.
Right. And he is at times in some very real danger. That's quite palpable, and he's trying to figure out how not to die.
Right, because it's like he was nearly killed in the first one and the second one and the third one. Well, he's nearly killed in all of them, and we should probably talk about that. But he, as we can talk a little bit more about the books as we go forward. But he is He's kind of an everyman, but maybe slightly off there, here and there. And but anyway, I think that putting him in different places. There's another book where he goes to Jamaica. He's probably going to go to another island nation in a book down the road. But I'm always looking for an exotic locale where I can tell a little bit about that story and about that place, and kind of. Cause I kind of stole that from James Bond. It's like part of the thrill of a Bond film is to see him in an exotic locale and trying to ply his wares there. So
right. Interesting. So one last question. I know we're running out of time. I'd like to, if you're willing, maybe come back and do another episode.
Oh, we haven't even finished here. We haven't even finished the entire history issue of Peru State and Cross Township.
Correct. Yeah.
But, sure.
But I did want to ask you. So you mentioned Tater, and you mentioned John as an everyman. Is Tater, in a lot of ways, maybe the sensibility or the conscience or sensibility of the everyman? Although you also have Simon, right?
Well, see, I love where you're going, because here, we'll go back to Star Trek for a minute. They often say that Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are the id, the ego, and the superego, right?
Interesting. Okay.
Now think about this. Tater's, Simon, and Pilot it's the id, the ego, and the superego. By the way, listeners, if you haven't read, Simon is kind of a doppelganger that, you're not sure, especially after this first book, if he's actually real, or if he's just in Pilot's head, or what's going on with that, or is it like a Sixth Sense kind of deal? I had people who used to think that all the time. They're like, it's like the Sixth Sense, isn't it? Pilot's dead, or this is that. And I was like, well, it could be. And I was like, God, that's better than what I wrote.
Just read on. Continue to read.
Yeah, but please keep reading, even though I don't have anything near that interesting. I think Tater's is definitely that aspect, though. The everyman, he's there to keep Pilot grounded in a way that a woman, a sexual and romantic partner can't, because Pilot has some issues, and that are. And by the way, Pilot's mental issues are part of an enormously long arc through this whole series. But I feel sorry for women who fall for Pilot, because he's damaged, he's broken in places, and sometimes the strain of a romantic relationship pushes hard on those broken places, and he lashes out and reacts poorly. And he has issues about being needed and wanted and desired and truly loved. So, but with Taters, who is not just he's a lot like, he is the guy who kind of grounds Pilot. And I say this because I've never really told you this that much, but you being my longest term guy friend, I mean, there is some of you there, because there is a love that Taters and Pilot have for each other that now you and I are better at expressing that with each other, but their expression of it's a little more like another buddy of mine who's got some of physical characteristics of Tater and some of the kind of the weird sense of humor that's Tater's. He and I care about each other too, but it's not like you and I express it. And I'm not. It's not bad. It's not good. It's just different people.
Sure.
So the everyman, but I like to look at him more as not quite everyman, but more as like, this is the anchor. This is the guy who, when Pilot is losing his mind, he's like, hey buddy, let's have a Modelo and calm down here, man. Because you do that for me all the time. You're like,